So treten wir mit der Jüdischen Akademie ein Erbe an, wohlwissend, dass es zum Teil unwiederbringlich verloren ist. Wir wollen einen modernen Ort jüdischen Denkens schaffen, einen Ort, der Denktraditionen des Judentums mitnimmt ins 21. Jahrhundert. Die jüdische Gemeinschaft und das ganze Land sollen diesen Ort des jüdischen Denkens und der Freiheit immer behalten.
Gebäude sind und bleiben Zeitzeugen. Überall um uns herum, egal wo wir hingehen, erzählen die Bauten Geschichten aus der Vergangenheit. Gebäude, die wir auch heute bauen, erzählen somit die Geschichten unserer Zeit für zukünftige Generationen.
Es ist ja nicht immer so im Leben, dass man sagt, das kriegen wir hin. Das haben wir hingekriegt. Das freut mich auch sehr persönlich. Und deshalb, meine Damen und Herren, gehen wir raus, machen wir das Fenster auf, mutig, klar und vor allen Dingen gemeinsam.
Franz Rosenzweig sagte ungefähr in den 20er Jahren, je jüdischer wir sind, umso realer können wir sein.
Sie haben diesen Prozess der Entwicklung, diesen Prozess, der uns trägt, etwas hier aufzubauen, das zwar an etwas erinnert, aber etwas ganz Neues werden wird.
Nein, es ist in der Tat so, dass dieser feierliche Spatenstich das Zeichen ist, dass die Jüdische Akademie beginnt, in der Realität anzukommen.
Good afternoon, dear guests, dear friends of the Jewish Museum and of the Jewish Academy of the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland. You've just seen a movie about an event that occurred a few months ago, which was what we call Spatenstich, for the new Academy of the Zentralrat der Juden in Frankfurt, being built here in Frankfurt, which is meant to open in about 2 years' time. And you're watching the second panel of the conference, Displaced, Jewish Experience in Post-War Europe, which is a cooperation between the Jewish Academy of the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland and the Jewish Museum Frankfurt. So it is my great honor, and I'm looking forward to the two lectures we're going to see in this panel. The first lecture and this panel has the broad title, Remembrance of the Holocaust, or Forms of Politics of Memory. And the first lecture is dedicated to Holocaust memory and forms of remembrance in Poland. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dariusz Stola. And Dariusz Stola is an historian, professor at the Institute for Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences. He has published 10 books and more than 150 articles on the history of Polish-Jewish relations, the communist regime in Poland, and international migrations in the 20th century, as well as contemporary discussions on these paths, including 3 monographs. The first one, I can't speak Polish, so I'm saying the English title, A Country with No Exit, Migrations from Poland, 1949 till 1989, from 2010. The second one being the Anti-Zionist Campaign in Poland, 1967 till 1968, in 2000. And the third one being Hope and the Holocaust in 1995. He serves at the Polish Academy of Sciences Committee on History and Committee on Migration Research, as well as at the advisory board of several Polish and international institutions and journals. In 2014 until 2019, he was the director of the Polen Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and that's where we know each other from. And he was a very, very distinguished colleague of mine. And it's a pleasure for me now to listen to Dariusz Stola. Welcome to the conference, Dariusz.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. Do you hear me well?
Wonderful.
Excellent. So it's my great pleasure to speak to you now, although I would love to be in Frankfurt rather than speak to you via Zoom in Warsaw. I would like to present you a very concise history of two parallel processes, the remembrance, the commemoration of the Holocaust in Poland, and the debates that were going parallelly and were related to these commemorations. These were two processes, one about making the past of the Jewish tragedy during the Second World War visible in a public space, and second was defining the meanings of the monuments, defining the meanings of the public imagery of what happened to Jews during the Second World War. And I believe that Poland is a unique country in this sense in Europe for two reasons. First, Holocaust makes a special part of Polish history because most of the victims of the Holocaust were Polish Jews. About 3 million out of 3.5, some 3.2 million Polish Jews perished during the war, did not survive the war, so only about 10% of the pre-war numbers survived, which makes Polish Jews the majority of all the Holocaust victims in Europe. Moreover, the lands of German-occupied Poland was the place of the execution of hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million, of foreign Jews who were deported to the death camps in occupied Poland. And for these reasons, non-Jewish Poles, ethnic Poles, as well as Ukrainians, Belarusians, Latvians, and others, were the largest groups of the eyewitness of the killing. First, of the ghettoization, the biggest number of the ghettos in German-occupied or German-dominated Europe was in Poland. Then of mass shooting that began in the summer of 1941 in what was at that time the Soviet territory, and eventually the construction of the killing centers equipped with the gas chambers. And the first one, Chełmno-Kulmków, was in part of Poland annexed to Germany. So non-Jewish Poles were the largest group to watch the horrible fate of their Jewish neighbors, very often at a close range. They were really eyewitness, people who could see, hear, and smell it. So in a sense, some debates about what to do about it, what should be the reactions of the non-Jewish populations, began already during the war. And already in the first years after the war, we have probably the first debate in Europe. What it was, what kind of lessons can we take from the genocide of the Jews? Let me mention that the introduction of the term genocide came from a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin. And also the first monuments or memorials to the Holocaust were erected in Poland. Let me now show you a few slides with the beginning of it. Just a second. So I begin with an illustration of this process, namely the monument erected in 1948. You see it on the first plan, the backside of the monument erected for the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And behind it, you see a beautiful modern building. This is the building of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews standing in front of it. And the axis between these two objects, between the monument erected right after the war by the people who had been the survivors of the Holocaust, people who had taken part in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising just a few years before that moment, and the Polen Museum, which was opened in 2013, the core exhibition in 2014, the axis between the two buildings, the place between the two buildings, for me is the symbolic place of the history I'm going to tell you. So first, you can see on the left the same monument, the monument of the heroes and martyrs of the Warsaw Ghetto, seen from the front side at the year of its erection. It's right after the unveiling of the monument. You can see it stands among the sea of ruins. This part of Warsaw, the northwestern Warsaw, was almost 100% destroyed. Only a couple of buildings remained, which you can see quite far away from there. So literally, the monument stood among the ruins, and it was not the first monument to the Warsaw Ghetto. There exists a smaller one. We cannot see it in this picture here. It was a small monument erected really right after the liberation, 1946. The first small monument to the ghetto was erected then in a small place that was cleared of the rubble. And then on the right, you can see the same place in the early 1960s. You see this new housing projects, for me, a symbol of a life returning to the place of death, although it was not a Jewish life. Before the war, this part of Warsaw was 90% Jewish. Jews made more than 30% of the population of the city, but still the monument was a very important marker in the public space. There were official commemorations every year for the anniversary of the Ghetto uprising, and senior political figures, including members of the Communist Party Politburo, participated in this commemoration. However, in the years in between, namely the so-called high Stalinist period, early 1950s, were the years of increasing distortion of the past of the Holocaust. First, the commemorative efforts that were really massive. I'm showing you the biggest monument erected in the late 1940s in Poland. But there were many smaller monuments erected by the Jewish survivors to their families, friends, comrades, to the communities that had disappeared during the years of war, and a massive effort of documentation. Jewish committees established historical commissions, and the historical commissions gathered hundreds and hundreds of accounts, various documents. Also, in this year began the excavation in search of the secret archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Ringelblum archive. However, with the Sovietization of Poland, this effort was suspended. The discussions on the past among the non-Jewish Poles were suspended, and the history of the German occupation became a general part of the Soviet-style historiography, which was explained as the ongoing struggle between the capitalism and socialism, where Heinrich Himmler was an ally of President of the United States, Harry Truman. And I mean it literally. In an exhibition in the Auschwitz, newly opened Auschwitz Museum, the picture of President Truman was hanging close to the picture of Heinrich Himmler. So these distortions lasted, I call it revolutionary internationalist distortions, because while the propaganda stressed many of the crimes committed by Nazi Germany, it was blurring the Jewish identity of most of these victims. Most of the Polish citizens who perished during the war were Jewish, and they were killed as Jews. But the propaganda listed them as just peaceful citizens in the Soviet Union. These were peaceful citizens of the Soviet Union. In Poland, these were the workers and peasants, and the Jewish identity was blurred, but I would say not to the extent it was in the Soviet Union. In the mid-1950s, along the Stalinization, there was a renewal of this commemorative effort. And for me, the symbol of the remembrance in the 1960s is, you can see on this monument. This is the monument of the death camp of Treblinka. It took almost a decade to make it, because the efforts, the committee to set it up in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the area was largely neglected. Actually, some people from the neighboring villages were digging gold, jewelry and gold teeth they could find in the mass graves in the area of the camp. So a rather horrible scenes. And not a proper commemoration. Only 55th was the committee established, and it took many years to first design by a competition and they to erect this monument. And what I'm going to stress here is that if you have seen any monuments in the Soviet Union pertaining to the Nazi crimes, they were about the peaceful peoples on the Soviet Union, whether they were actively hiding the fact that the victims were Jewish. Of course, in case these were the sites of the mass killing of the Jews. In this case, and you can see it on the right, this is the inscription. It's never again, but never again has also inscription in the Hebrew letters. It doesn't hide the victims were Jews. So even the most distorting monument erected in the site of a Jewish massacre, which was a small monument in the town of Jedwabne, which I'm going to come back in a few minutes, in a small town of Jedwabne in summer of 1941, with the inspiration of a group of German officers, probably a commander of the Einsatzgruppe, a local Polish population killed at least a few hundred of the Jewish neighbors, which was the topic of the well-known book by Professor Jan Tomasz Gross. So in the 1960s, a monument was erected there, who misleadingly assigned responsibility to the Nazis, but it didn't hide the victims were Jews. And I think that was the difference between Poland and other communist countries. And especially in the Soviet Union, there was a kind of organized oblivion, hiding the fact that Jews of the, at least western part of the Soviet Union was massively killed, and especially in the summer of 1941 and early 1942. In Poland, it was not highlighted, it was not completely hidden. And we see it in other places that the Jewish identity of the victims is not erased. Moreover, in these years, we see many outstanding works of art, of literature, film, sculpture, dedicated or related to the Holocaust. Of course, the term Holocaust was not yet in use at that time, but I think it's really important that while in the school curricula, there was no separate topic. There was, of course, a topic about the crimes of Nazi Germany, but the fate of Jews was not treated largely or sometimes not at all, but it was present in the literature, in powerful works such as those written right after the war in the 1940s, before the Sovietization, or Polish audience could see it in the films of and books of the 1960s. However, this was largely stopped in late 1960s with the so-called anti-Zionist campaign. It was in reaction to the Youth Rebellion in the spring of 1968, which was a global phenomenon. Polish communist government reacted with police brutality, but also with a propaganda campaign claiming that Jews, in this case Jews called Zionists, were a conspiracy behind the rebellion. So there was a wave of mass protests organized by the Communist Party, and you can see the banners, Zionists to Israel, we demand the purge of the party of the Zionist filth, or Zionist to die. Some 15,000 Jews, which was at that time a half of the Jewish population in Poland, emigrated, including most of the Jewish historians. So a relatively strong tradition of Holocaust research, or research on the genocide of the Jews, because the term Holocaust was not used, who was quite vibrant in communist Poland up to the 1960s, was almost completely destroyed. And I must mention that some of the earliest works on the Holocaust published in the world were published in communist Poland. They had a clear ideological tendency to explaining, Nazi Germany as an outcome of imperialist capitalism. However, at that time, a lot of basic documentary work was done, which we used to the present day. So following the anti-Zionist campaign of 1968 up to the late 1980s, the history of the Jews and the history of the Holocaust, that was the bleakest period in terms of commemoration and education on this topic. And things began to change during the 1980s. And that was because of the gradual erosion of the communist regime, namely the emergence of a certain zone of freedom of speech in the underground illegal publications of the Solidarity movement. But also after 1983, the government of General Jaruzelski was so desperately needing Western support, Poland was practically bankrupt, that it allowed for a limited revival of Holocaust research and commemoration. So we see again top political figures coming to the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto for the anniversary, and also certain opening for publications. And that made some room for the first major debate still in communist Poland in 1987, following a publication of an article in a Catholic weekly. And let me stress, because this Catholic weekly was one of the censored but independent newspapers printed in the Soviet bloc, an article by Professor Jan Błoński, which was basically beginning with a poem written by Czesław Miłosz, a Nobel Prize laureate, a Polish poet, written in 1943 in occupied Warsaw, when Miłosz was watching the Warsaw Ghetto in flames. It raised the topic of the reactions of non-Jewish Poles. What were the attitudes of non-Jewish Poles? And demanded a moral compensation for indifference. Moral compensation for, as Błoński named it, the loneliness of Jewish victims during the war. And I stress it because this way Poland began the discussions on the Holocaust that later on followed in many other countries, but to Eastern Europe they came later because of the communist regime. In most of other countries they began only in the 1990s. So Poland was sooner, and also there was clearly a very emotional background to them. And these debates continued in the 1990s. And you know, it's difficult to show the debates. I'm showing you some of the drawings that the media printed along, and you can see questions of the Christian-Jewish relationship and entangled history of Christian Poles and the Jews, the question of martyrdom of the two groups, and the question of complicity or responsibility for the crimes and certain difficulty to accept them. And through 1990s, we had several such debates, and along the debates, there was also a revision of certain monuments to the Holocaust or erection of new monuments that were neglected or not completed during the communist period. And the most important out of this was this monument. This is the monument at the site of the death camp of Bełżec in southeastern Poland, which had a small monument erected in the 1960s, but after the 1968, it was neglected. It really was in a very bad shape. I was there as a young student in 1984. It was rather a dramatic view, walking in a forest, because before evacuation, the Nazis planted trees on the site of the completely destroyed death camp. So walking in this forest, you could find fragments of human relics, human bones laying on the ground. So in the 1990s, and first, again, it took several years. First was the competition, and then the construction of this very powerful monument. If you ever come to southeastern Poland, please see. I have seen many Holocaust monuments, but this one seems to me one of the most powerful. It's also interesting because it was erected in Polish foreign cooperation. An important contributor to making this monument was the American Jewish Committee and some of the leaders of the American Jewish Committee who personally were involved in this project. And I think this is something not untypical for Poland, for democratic Poland after 1989, that much of the debates and some of the commemoration is a reaction to Poles meeting with the new role of the Holocaust in the culture of the, let's call it, West. That in the 1980s and 1990s, Holocaust, which in the 1960s was largely a neglected topic in European history. Certainly, it was not a central topic of historiography of Europe before 1970s. In the 1980s and 1990s, it took a very central role in the history of Europe and is referred to in all kinds of discussions as a moral point of reference, as the radical evil of the European 20th century, which for societies of communist Europe or post-communist Europe was certain novelty, especially these societies where Jewish history and the history of the Holocaust had been marginalized. So to some extent, these Polish debates of the 1990s and also Polish efforts at commemoration were a reaction to what we were calling at that time going back to Europe or joining Europe. Again, this process of Europeanization of Polish political system, of Polish economy, but also modes and forms of commemoration. When the monument in Bełżec was under construction, that means we already knew that who won the competition for the design. It was a team by Andrzej Sołyga and Marcin Roszczyk, 1987, but the monument was only unveiled together with a small museum in 2004. In early 2000s, 2001, actually, we had the 20th anniversary last year. Poland had the biggest debate on the Holocaust. Moreover, it was not just the biggest debate on Polish-Jewish relations or the Holocaust, it was the biggest debate we have ever had on any event of the past, the biggest debate on history that Poland ever had. And this debate started with a little book, you can see it on the left, a little book published in Polish in 2000, and in the following years in some 20 languages, also in English and in German. The English name is Neighbors, Polish is Sąsiedzi, and this is really a small book exactly about the killing of the Jews by the Polish neighbors in the little town of Jedwabne in the summer of 1941. While the debates of the late 1980s and 1990s, the most difficult topic for a Polish audience to accept was indifference of many Poles, or the passivity in face of the Jewish tragedy, insufficient help extended to the Jews. The topic of the book, which you can see in front of you now, was not passivity, but active participation in killing. So for many people, it was a shock. There were hundreds and hundreds of articles, many people took positions beginning with the president of Poland, the Catholic bishops, philosophers, but also ordinary men and women. A new monument was erected in the town of Jedwabne instead of this misleading monument from the 1960s. And I believe it was a high point sometime between the debate on this book and unveiling of the monument in Bełżec, the high point of the open Polish debates and the efforts to commemorate the Jewish tragedy, and especially the tragedy of Polish Jews. On this slide, you can also see the front pages of the two following books by Professor Gross, The Fear, which was about anti-Semitism in the early post-war years, especially the pogrom in Kielce in 1946, and Golden Harvest. And Golden Harvest was exactly about gold mining in the sites of the former death camps in post-war Poland. So these two smaller books, they didn't generate such a huge debates, although there was a certain pattern of debate that developed. And while almost every European country had some kind of debates about the Holocaust, from Norway to Greece and from Portugal to Finland. That means not only countries that were allies to Nazi Germany, not only Germany had many, with the historical strike in the 1980s, but practically all European states, also those that were occupied by Germany, like Poland, and those that were neutral, like Switzerland. You probably have heard of the German banks that were keeping the assets of the victims of the Holocaust, or the Swedish debates about the involvement of some Swedish companies in the German war effort. So to my knowledge, only 2 European countries did not have such debates, but this reflects not their history, but their presence. And these 2 countries are Belarus and Russia. It reflects the nature of the public space and the authoritarian character of the political regimes, not the history, because the Holocaust in Belarus is one of the most dramatic chapters of the history of Jews in German-occupied Europe. So this, as I said, the debate about Jedwabne was the climax of the Polish debates. And the erection of the monument in Bełżec almost coincided. It was a few years later, but still the debate was going on and had secondary effects. And here I'm showing you a few more pictures, and they reflect some key topics. So the central picture of a man and other people trying to close his eyes and his ears is about, hiding difficult past, hiding the difficult truths. On the right, you see the symbols of digging into the past, the Christian with a cross and the Jewish with a shield of David. And on the left, this is a graphic expression, a visual expression of certain competition of victimhood. Who was the bigger victim of the Second World War? And for many Poles who were educated in the in schools receiving the message that ethnic Poles suffered horribly under the Nazi occupation, which of course was true. Yes, a few million ethnic Poles were killed by the Nazis and they suffered as slave labor and prisoners of the concentration camps. But still, only some 10% of non-Jewish Poles perished during the war, while 90% of Polish Jews did perish at that time. And finally, you see the plus and the minus. And here, the author reflects the fact that many people are willing to uphold the positive aspect of the past, but only few are ready to uphold the negatives, what is difficult in the past. So I believe that these discussions, which culminated in early 2000s, but they didn't end it. There were 2 more books by Professor Gross and some other topics, which I'm going to tell you in a second. But for me, they not only expressed certain readiness of Poles to talk about the difficult past and the fact that Poland has a difficult past, that indeed the Polish Jewish history is complex, and especially the history of the 6 years of German occupation when almost all Polish Jews perished, and the way it was presented throughout the communist regime was largely inadequate. So most of the Poles could face it only in the 1990s with a delay of some 40 years in the 1990s, and 2000 contributed to this debate. But for me, they also were an effect of the development of Polish democracy, certain approval that we may have a plurality of opinions about the past, that we may disagree, the disagreement, there is not something wrong, that we should make efforts to reach a shared conclusion about what happened, especially moral conclusions, which are the moral basis of a democratic society. But at the same time, these debates were contributing to Polish democracy. So there was a positive relation between one and the other, between the process of building a democratic state of the rule of law and the process of coming to terms with the Holocaust. It was not the same process or process very much similar to one that had happened in Western Germany during the war. I believe that each country must have its own path, but the relation between the two, I think it's worth noting. And parallel to this process of coming to terms with the Holocaust was quite massive, maybe not a universal, but really substantial process of a grassroots commemoration of the Holocaust. That means in the hundreds of places, small memorial plaques were erected on the building of former synagogue, or in the center of the town, or in a place of an execution, or on a wall of a Jewish cemetery. The Jewish cemeteries, and in Poland we have more than 1,200 cemeteries or former cemeteries, because in many places it's difficult to recognize. The matzevot, the tombstones, were destroyed or during the German occupation or after the war in the communist period. So there was quite massive grassroots, really bottom-up effort to commemorate, to clear the cemeteries, to leave a mark of the Jewish history of a given place, especially in the small towns. Many small towns of Poland before the war had 30%, 50% Jewish population, which in 1989 were barely mentioned anywhere. And I think this is maybe the most important consequence of the 1990s and the 2000s, the grassroots movement, which has its material aspect, and these are the small monuments, but also the immaterial, the social aspect. Many people who have been involved, many local communities, individuals, sometimes religious groups, because Polish society is or was up to the recently massively Roman Catholic. In most of the cases, these people were Polish Catholics. And actually, because the Jewish community in Poland is very small, it's only a few thousand people, most of these efforts were by the non-Jewish Poles. And also the debates which I have mentioned, debates which you can see on the pictures here represented, were not the debates between Polish Jews and the non-Jewish Poles. These were Polish debates. So the division lines were running across the Polish ethnic group and also across the Polish church. In fact, the groups most active in the debates, both in opening the past, opening for a debate, initiating the debates, were Catholics, and also those who most strongly opposed them were the Catholics. In fact, we're speaking about the open church, closed church, And the attitudes towards the past of Polish-Jewish relations was one of the most important differentia specifica, differing features of these two segments of Polish Catholicism. Already during the Jedwabne debate in the early 2000s, we could see a group of people who didn't like it at all, who were very angry and irritated about some people like Professor Gross trying to revise a picture of Poland as a country of martyrdom and heroism. And they were using very strong wording like treason, lies, denying completely, even denying what the historians could very effectively prove. And that was the beginning of what later on a colleague of mine, younger colleague of mine, Piotr Forecki, called in his book, the backlash, the growing movement against the revision of Polish history, against the new approach to Polish-Jewish past, and for consolidating, defending, and solidifying the image of Poland as a heroic, innocent nation of victims. So this tendency has its most visible, before I move to this moment, I need to show you again the opening of the Polin Museum in 2013 and its core exhibition in 2014. As I said, the relation between the monument and the building is for me crucial. The museum is not a Holocaust museum. And I say we, as a former director of the museum, we have stressed it repeatedly that Polinis is not a Holocaust museum, is the museum of the all history of Polish Jews, not only the 6 years of the German occupation, but it makes a part of the memorial complex of the Warsaw Ghetto. So while the monument commemorates the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto by showing how they died, how they fought and died, Polin Museum commemorates the victim of the Warsaw Ghetto by showing how they lived, them, their parents, great-parents, and great-great-great-parents down to the Middle Ages. So it's this dialogue between the Holocaust, which dramatically changed the Jewish history in Poland, but didn't end it. There was the Jewish history in communist Poland also, of course, much smaller, much more restricted, but it didn't end with the Holocaust. But moreover, this effort not to make the Holocaust shadow back on the prior history of Polish Jews and somehow diminish the contribution of Polish Jews to the history of the Jews globally, to the history of Jewish diaspora and the history of Poland. And so that was 2014, 13-14, but the museum as the institution was established as a public-private partnership in 2005. And I do believe that was one of the consequences of the debate about Jedwabne. The debate about Jedwabne showed really maybe not a completely unity of the Polish political elite, but widespread agreement that we must do something about the Polish Jewish past. We should be proactive. And the act of the establishment of the Polin Museum, which is a public-private partnership between the Ministry of Culture, that means the National Government of Poland, the City of Warsaw, the local government, and the Jewish Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, so an NGO supported by Polish Jews abroad, was signed by Lech Kaczyński, at that time the mayor of Warsaw, the president of Warsaw. So you had a conservative, you had a representative of the government, which at that time was a left liberal government with the Social Democratic Party and the Jewish organization. And that was showing this new culture of liberal pluralism, I would say, and a shared understanding that Jewish history is important and the Holocaust history is important. Also at that time in Warsaw, since that time we could see a beautiful monument to the Warsaw Ghetto, namely stones that mark the borders of the Warsaw Ghetto. You can see them in the pavement, in the asphalt of the streets, the border of the Warsaw Ghetto that covered a large section of northwestern Warsaw. So in about 2010-15, it seems that everything is okay, that Poland is moving in the right direction, that we have a growing historiography, we have a young generation of historians, we have new monuments erected in hundreds of small towns and other localities, we have educational projects at various levels, but things changed. And these positive outcomes, you can see here the numbers before the pandemics up to 2019, 3.5 million people visited the museum, of which 1.7 million to the core exhibition. So really, it very quickly became a very popular museum with actually millions of people coming to see, and most of them were Polish. And speaking about the commemoration, for the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as I said, even in communist Poland, some senior political figures were showing up for the commemoration, maybe hiding, not using the word Jew at this commemoration, but still being present. Now, for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising anniversary of April 19, every year, we organized the daffodil campaign. You can see a paper daffodil, which unfolds into the yellow Star of David. Under German occupation, it was a sign of exclusion. Jews were ordered in many localities to wear the yellow Stars of David to make them separate from the rest of the population. Before the pandemics, because now it's difficult to compare, 250,000 of such paper daffodils were distributed in Warsaw alone. So, you know, Warsaw is a city of some 2 million people, so some more than 10% of the population had the daffodils. So the future was looking bright. However, things have changed. And here we come to 2018, when under the new government of Poland, the populist government of Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński, the brother of Lech Kaczyński, who is a co-founder of the Polish Museum, this party suddenly rushed through the parliament a new legislation, and I'm sorry for giving you the slide in Polish, but these are the legal acts and some tweets of the politicians of this party, as well as the picture of the Prime Minister of Poland and Israel shaking hands. So the parliament suddenly legislated a new act which penalized the statements about alleged complicity of the Polish nation or the Polish state in the Nazi crimes. So it, of course, initiated another controversy, one more controversy. However, this time the initiating side were not historians who were trying to explain to the broader public that there was something dramatic in the past that you should know. This time, these were politicians trying to close the debate, actually intimidate historians from raising difficult topics. And although the authors of this legislation claim that they only want to correct wrong statements, such as statements on Polish death camps, and indeed, every year, some 100 to 200 times globally in various newspapers, people use the term Polish concentration camps or Polish death camps, which in Polish is really insultive. In English, it may be a camp in Poland, a Nazi camp in Poland, but some people out of ignorance believe that the Poles were somehow involved in the erecting of this camp. So for the politicians of the ruling party, it was a good pretext, I believe, to force this legislation, while the obvious effect was what we call chilling effect, making scholars, journalists, various activists really think twice before they start talking on difficult subjects like Polish Jewish history. And it was not only Polish debate in Poland, it was also international debate with very strong reactions in Israel and strong reactions by the American government as well. So after a few months, eventually Polish government backed off. It removed the most controversial fragments of this legislation, not all of them, some of them, and that was the compromise between the Prime Minister Morawiecki and Prime Minister Netanyahu. You see them shaking hands here, and nobody was happy. My colleagues of Israel didn't like the Israeli statement. We in Poland, we didn't like the Polish statement. However, it ended this dramatic crisis of spring 2018, which was dramatic not only because it introduced this bad legislation, it also unleashed a mass, really a wave of anti-Semitic hate speech in Polish internet. It was also, I would say, the most counterproductive legislation. If the legislation was to stop statements like Polish death camps, it was really counterproductive because, as I said, before that time, Polish diplomats in their reports reported such incidences, and they were reacting, sending letters to the editors usually, and usually the media, the editors responded positively that they made a mistake, they will not make it again. In 2018, in the global media, the term Polish death camps was repeated several million times while presenting this debate. And of course, the mood of the media was the Poles want to hide something bad in the past. So in this sense, it was also counterproductive. But it was productive in raising emotions in Poland which play into the hands of the populist government. Because this government is not openly anti-Semitic, it's actually very pro-Israeli, or at least it was very pro-Israeli at that time. It was really working hard not to show up as Jewish, but it's very eager to exploit the resentment and xenophobic emotions that were a consequence of this debate. So I'm afraid that what has happened in 2018 and what continues to this day, because we have historians harassed. Two of my colleagues had a trial, not with a public prosecutor. It was a civil court case, but still, eventually they won it. But still, I'm afraid that the chilling effect, making some people, especially younger scholars, more cautious when they talk or write about the topic is already there. However, it did not stop the commemorating activity. I would rather say there is a perverse effect of this controversies, namely the Holocaust is back in the center stage. It's gradually moving from the margins where it had been under the communist regime to the center of the stage of Polish history of the 20th century. With the general polarization of Poland, it's now much more difficult to have a shared conclusion about what happened, how should we judge the events of the past and so on. But still, I believe this tendency was not completely stopped. Moreover, these local grassroots initiatives continue. So for example, this year, we have seen in some 200 places that the Jewish cemeteries were cleared. We have seen several new monuments erected to the history of local Jews or at the places of the execution. So this grassroots activity is continuing, but these local activists whom I was talking to, all of them agree that the atmosphere is much more, is different. It's much more difficult than it was, let's say, 6 or 10 years ago. I'm about to end my presentation because it's been already 44 minutes on my clock. So before I end, let me stress this relation between commemoration and discussion, because there is certain symbiotic relationship. Very much as the monument which you can see here, the fact that politicians of very different background, social democratic, conservative, liberal, decided to financially support the construction of a major cultural institution. It's a major institution known very well in Poland and internationally. I believe the debate on the Jedwabne crime contributed to their awareness and their decision. And then the monuments themselves remind the population, especially the younger population, of a past they cannot see. Like in Warsaw, Warsaw was almost completely destroyed. There are a few relics of Jewish Warsaw that were not rebuilt or completely remade after the war. And the similar story is in many places. So commemoration is really to make memory work. The material commemoration helps reviving the memory of the history of Polish Jews. And the debates are important first because they bring it to the fore of the public, of the media, first of all, and the public discussion. But they also help us define what of the legacies of the past we believe is important. What should we remember? What our children should remember? What kind of conclusion should we derive from the experiences of the past? And I hope that this positive feedback loop, that the symbiosis between the public debates and public commemoration and small-scale local commemorations of the Polish Jewish history and the Holocaust in particular will continue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dariusz, for your lecture and your open words on the past year's developments. And I would first like to go back with you to the immediate post-war times, because you were mentioning that, you know, there has been the Jewish Historical Commissions already in 1944 in Lublin, and there's been a tremendous work of these commissions to collect and record the memory in immediate post-war times, and this form of collecting and documenting what happened is something else than building a monument. So that's my first question to you. Like, what is actually the impulse or the motivation from your perspective to build those early monuments? Or what is the path from documentation towards representation of what happened?
So these were actually parallel processes. Well, documentation started already during the war. And the symbol of it is the Ringelblum archive and the Onek Shabbat, the group around Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw Ghetto. The people who have gathered these documents and managed to hide them before the final destruction of the ghetto, and most of what they dug under the buildings of the Warsaw Ghetto, we could recover, not all of it. A part of it was lost. So it began with this documentation. And the moment of the return of the survivors to Poland after the war, and most of Polish Jews who survived the war in the Soviet interior. Mm-hmm. Only a small minority survived the war in hiding or with the false documents. In Poland, some of them survived the war in concentration camps, but the largest, 80% of them survived the war in the Soviet Union. So they returned to Warsaw and meeting for the first time the eyewitness of these crimes, the Jews who could have seen it. This is this shocking moment and an immediate desire to mark it. That means the emptiness. In one of the memoirs I remember, I think that was an inhabitant of Biłgoraj coming to his town and noting that the main square of the town, the market square, was paved with the tombstones, with matzevot. So in fact, he felt like in a cemetery in the middle of the town. The synagogue was destroyed, everything was destroyed. So to mark the families, their friends, the people they loved, that was the first effect, but also a political motivation. And we can see in these early monuments of the Warsaw Ghetto that Bundists and Zionists are particularly active and you know, stressing the message. The Jewish population in Poland at that time was very politically active. And then 1940s differ from all the following periods, not only because of certain broader sphere of the freedom of speech. We have Communist Party in the government, but we don't have yet communist regime. There are opposition parties, and in the Jewish community, there are several parties. There was a relative plurality of voices at that time in Poland under the communist government. So we see a debate, and we have a community of at least 200,000 people, and something like 40%, almost half of them, emigrate, leave Poland, especially after the Kielce pogrom. So the declining number of Jews means there is and less people who can and do actively remember. They are overrepresented among the scholars. There are many artists, Jewish or of Jewish origin, who are expressing themselves, their own experience of war. But the large group of people who were so much willing to erect these early monuments was no longer in Poland. Actually, most of them at that time were already in Israel.
Mm. Yeah, that's another question that occurred to me, because we had Kamil Kijek talking about Rzeszów and at the Upper Silesian region, where you know, until 48 or even until 56, actually there was quite a percentage of Jews living in this region and actually defining you know, how one could live and building up something. So I was wondering, and in the displaced person camps in the US zone, like here in Frankfurt and Salzheim, the majority of the displaced person camp were Polish Jews. So I was wondering if there ever was the idea of the notion in this process of the building of Polish nationhood after the war to actually include Jews in this process and define them as Polish citizen.
Well, yeah, you're right, and this I need to clarify, because up to late 1945, it was not clear what would be the nature of the post-war Poland. Even the Polish communists in the Soviet Union, some of them had an idea of very homogeneous nation state. Mm-hmm. And it was to some extent thanks to the lobbying, to the begging, to a very active position of those Polish Jews who were in the Soviet Union, that first they were allowed to emigrate to Poland, to come back to Poland, because other minorities, Ukrainians, Belarusians, of course, Germans or Lithuanians, they could not come. Mm-hmm. So that was the moment when Jews were recognized as the only recognized ethnic minority, because there were some Ukrainians still in Poland, of course, some ethnic Germans, but they were not recognized as separate groups who could establish their own organizations. Only the Jews were. And Jewish communists, at least there were two groups of Jewish communists, those working among the Jews, the Yiddishist communists of Poland, and there were Polish communists of Jewish origin, and some of them were really important in the leadership of the Communist Party. They believed that in this new Poland, they can rebuild Jewish life and it will be a new life, a socialist Jewish life. So actually there were certain similarities between ideas of the Jewish communists in Poland after the war and left-wing Zionists. Mm-hmm. That to see the Jewish catastrophe of the Second World War as an opening of a new chapter, mm-hmm. to build a just society without exploitation, a society which of course for the communists should be secular, but also cultivate the Yiddish culture. So the secular but Yiddishist dimension of what did it mean to be Jewish, I think is important for the 1940s. Later on, especially after 57, because there was a wave of immigration in 56, 57, when the number of Jews from some 80,000 declined to some 30,000, it was too small to sustain this culture. And we see the process of accelerated acculturation. That means the younger generation no longer speaks Yiddish. But still, I think you're right that up to the late 1940s, many people could cultivate certain hopeful vision of a Jewish future in Poland.
Mm. I have another question that relates to Polish-Jewish-German relations, because it occurs to me, that we saw the monument on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. From a German eye, you always see Willy Brandt, 1970, kneeling in front of the monument, and that was really a change in German commemoration culture and in German-Polish relation too. So I was wondering if this doesn't really play a role in the whole, path that you were portraying. That that was in 1970, Willy Brandt, and whereas you were saying from 1968 on. Due to the anti-Semitic campaign of the communist regime, actually Holocaust was pushed aside. So I was wondering, what was the reception of Willy Brandt's kneeling in front of this monument?
This is an excellent question. It has. I'm sorry I don't have the photographs now to show you how differently this moment, this historical moment of Brandt kneeling in front of the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto, was presented in photographs in Poland and in the West, in West Germany, because in the pictures published in the West, you very often see him kneeling, and you can see a part of the menorah. A part of the monument is a menorah. Mm-hmm. The pictures published in the Polish newspapers, they don't show what is in front of him. In fact, the most popular photograph that were given a prominence is that he is kneeling and you can see a Polish soldier standing on guard. So in the propaganda of the Polish Communist Party, Brandt was apologizing for all German crimes in German-occupied Poland. Mm-hmm. So this Jewish aspect, the Holocaust dimension of it was blurred it was far from clear for which group of the crimes he wanted to express apology this way. So, it was only in the 1990s that things changed, and you can see that which pictures of this moment are circulated, they appear. So in this way, Poland was joining the Western perception of this monument only in the 1990s. And this moment has now its own monument. At the far end of the square, which was, well, before the Polin Museum was erected, it was a huge park. So at the far end from the Ghetto monument stands a small monument commemorating this act of Willy Brandt in Warsaw in 1970. Mm-hmm. It was erected in late 1990s.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I have another question about Jan Gross. I mean, that's a debate that's been, widely acknowledged also internationally, and he's a renowned scholar, international scholar. So there is actually in the person of Jan Gross, as far as I know, a personal link to 68 and to the expulsion of 68. So the forced expulsion of Jews from 68. So I was wondering, I mean, today's government, of course, is opposing the communist period and defines itself completely differently, whereas at this point of view, a person who was, forcefully couldn't live in Poland anymore puts up a perspective that is not accepted. Maybe you could comment on that.
No, I'm quite sure. I have written a book myself on 1968, and Jan Gross, as a young, he was at that time assistant at the Warsaw University, assistant professor, a young man. There are some files of the Communist Security Service about his activity. So he was one of the leaders of the student rebellion at that time, and together with many of his friends were forced into emigration as a consequence of the so-called anti-Zionist campaign. So when many of his opponents like to present him as a Jew, this is a foreign American Jew born in Poland, but he hates Poland, so he distorts the history of heroic Polish nation. And someone once asked Professor Gross, so who are you? Are you Polish or Jewish or American? And he said, I'm Polish and Jewish and American. And I think this is the right answer. For me, he is a beautiful example of the Polish intelligentsia, which is a group defined not just by education, but also by a certain sense of civic responsibility. Mm-hmm. Intelligentsia is not just that you have a university diploma. It means that you engage in public affairs and you feel responsible for public matters. So this is one in terms of motivation. And second, maybe not the book about Jedwabne, but certainly his book about Polish society under German occupation and Polish society under Soviet occupation, which he published many years ago. So I believe they reflect his experience, for example, his theory about a privatization of violence, how totalitarian regimes encourage people to denounce each other. So, I'm pretty sure this is what he saw in Poland in the spring of 1968, and then elaborated into a theory of a social behavior. For me, what is interesting is that while I disagree with him on some aspects of his books, but what he did to the Polish debates is really great, because he was rhetorically the most effective public historian in the history of this country. And it really deserves respect. I may disagree with him, but without him, these great debates and all the consequences, including not just the Polin Museum, but films, theater dramas, poetry, paintings, sculptures, which were produced by Polish artists in reaction to debate. So this is his contribution to a much bigger change than just historiography of the Second World War in Poland.
One last very, very short question before we go to the next lecture. I was wondering on your perception on the monument that is now being discussed for Poles that were murdered in the Holocaust in the midst of Berlin. There is this initiative for a long time. It's not really occurred, it's not really caused a big debate, but there has been now the decision that, there should be a monument commemorating the death of Poles in the Holocaust in the midst of Berlin. And I was wondering, from the background for what you portrayed, is this, sign of a backlash? Is this sign of becoming more and more aware in Germany that there is non-Jewish Poles suffered? Is this a sign of nationalization of groups of victims? What's your take on that?
Well, there are many initiatives in Poland. Actually, I see certain obsession with building monuments around the country. But if you speak about the monument to the Polish rescuers of the Jews, and that was the idea, actually, that was the idea of a survivor, of one of the major friends, big donors of the Polish Museum, who insisted on building in Poland a monument to the rescuers. We have a couple of monuments to the rescuers of the Jews, the righteous who were helping the Jews during the war. So the idea of building a monument to the rescuers, this is not controversial. I think these people deserve all our respect and they should be commemorated. The question was where to locate it. And there were several ideas where to put it. I very much favored the idea to make it outside of the former ghetto. And for example, in a place where one of these righteous was living during the war. However, I was not completely against building it closer to the Polish Museum, but certainly not in the memorial complex of the Holocaust, which is in front of the museum. This is the memorial complex of the Holocaust. This place should be reserved. There are already in this area some 14 smaller or bigger commemorations. The big monument you have seen, but also there is a series of black stones erected in the 1980s in memory of certain leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto, but also the Żegota, the underground Polish organization to help the Jews. So I would say it's dense of monuments, this area. So I was against it, although I was not against making the monument at the far end, somewhere close to the Brand monument. And not figurative, because this is the third question. What is the right form of such monument? And someone can say that this is a matter of taste, but I believe that in fields so sensitive as the memory of the Shoah, the form is as important as the content, because the form is the meaning, the form is the content. So this initiative, it actually ran aground. It was one more Polish discussion about where to locate it back in 2014, 2015. And it was suspended with this deterioration of the atmosphere in 2018. I haven't heard about it for a long time. In last years, I have heard of very different initiatives to commemorate the Polish rescuers. And these are clearly initiatives coming from the government, and more specifically from the Pilecki Institute, which is a government-funded agency. And this agency is funding small monuments in various small localities where Polish rescuers were persecuted or killed by the Germans during the war. And recently we had really a scandal of such a small monument erected, actually very close to the death camp of Treblinka, in the village of Treblinka, which, that is controversial, but still open for discussion. What for me was unacceptable was that the basis for the story that there was a Polish person, Christian Paul, who wanted to help the Jews is based on a single account, on an account of a single person. So very shaky grounds. And I think it shows the tendency of the present government to actually inflate the scale of the Polish assistance. That means to, as if it was massive, it was certainly not massive. It was a heroic minority, and usually heroes are a minority. And the attempts to present them as representatives of the majority are completely unfounded.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. Your answer is very interesting. I was, because it shows again, as in the Kniefall of Willy Brandt, that, we have different discourse, and I was referring to what is called the Polen monument in German discourse today, and that is meant to be, a new monument in the city, in the capital city of Berlin, commemorating, the fact that there were, Poles being murdered in the Holocaust.
Sorry for misunderstanding you.
and that's, I think, really an interesting question relating to it. How to, whether every victim group needs its own monument in the city of Berlin. How do you distinguish between Jewish Poles or Polish Jews and Poles, and I think that will be a core question, I think, also in further debates, at least in Germany. I don't know if it will be a crucial question debates in Poland, but in Germany I assume will be. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dariusz, we move on to the next lecture, and later on we'll try to discuss the next lecture together. I'd like to announce a small change in the program, because the next lecture on monuments, missing monuments, and we have two persons giving this lecture to us, and these two persons are very dear to me because they are both former colleagues. It's Kata Bohus and Moritz Bauerfeind, who both happen to be curators. Kata Bohus, the main curator of our show, Our Courage, Jews in Europe, 1945 to 1948, and Moritz was working with her as a curator and curatorial assistant back then. So let me introduce the two colleagues or former colleagues. Kata Bohus is a senior researcher advisor at the Arctic University of Norway today. Previously, she worked here at the Jewish Museum and at the Simon Dubno Institute in Leipzig, and as a curator of this show. From 2014 until 2016, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the Lichtenberg Kolleg of the Georg August University of Göttingen. She received her PhD from Central European University in 2014 with a dissertation on communist state politics towards Jews during the early Kadar era in Hungary. She has published several articles on Holocaust memory and memorialization in communist Hungary, the reception history of Anne Frank's diary, and communist interpretations of the Eichmann trial in Eastern Europe. The volume she edited together with Peter Hallammer and Stefan Stach, entitled Growing in the Shadow of Anti-Fascism, Remembering the Holocaust in Communist Eastern Europe, will be published by Central European University Press in February 2022. And Kata is going to give a lecture together with Moritz Bauerfeind, who studied history and Slavic study in Bamberg and Olomouc. From 2017 to 2019, he worked as a scientific trainee at the Jewish Museum Frankfurt, which I already said, where he curated, together with Kata and my colleagues Werner Hanak and Erik Riedel, the current show, which will be on display until tomorrow, Our Courage, Jews in Europe, 1945 to 1948. In the dissertation project he started thereupon, he deals with the impact of reform-oriented rabbis on Jewish emancipation in the first half of the 19th century. He has been working in Basel as an assistant for Jewish history at the Center for Jewish Studies since February 2020. And I heard you both give the lecture together, so I'm looking forward to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And I'm going to start sharing my screen as well. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, we see everything. Thank you, Kata.
Great, great. I can only echo the words of Professor Stola. I would love to be in Frankfurt right now. Miriam knows how much my heart broke when I had to cancel my and my family's tickets because of the new wave of this pandemic. But hopefully soon we will be back again. And as Miriam mentioned, both I and my colleague Moritz, we worked on this exhibit that is now closing. And we thought that today we're going to give you a little bit of a blick behind the curtains, because today we are going to present on two issues that we explored, that we researched when we were preparing the exhibit, but even, sometimes even 450 square meters are not enough to include everything. So these are two stories that were not included in the exhibit. However, we think that they are very interesting, and also in some ways they are also connected to what Professor Stola was talking about. So one of the main topics of our exhibit, Our Courage, is the presentation of early Holocaust memorialization. For a long time, I'm trying to, oh, sorry, I went too far in my presentation. Oh, sorry. Here we go. So for a long time, the consensus in academia had that Jewish survivors kind of kept silent about their experiences during the war. However, this notion has been refuted, and our exhibit also shows numerous examples from within the European Jewish survivor communities. Professor Stola's first picture was also such a monument that was erected right after the war. In 1947, and I also brought here two pictures for you that we included in our exhibit. One is from Białystok, about the commemoration of the Ghetto uprising there in 1947. Actually, this monument is still standing. It looks a little bit different today, but this column, which is actually very typical of early Holocaust monuments, is still there. And the other one was a poster from the American zone of Germany that won a graphic design competition, and which called for survivors to record their memories of the recent events. I would like to point out that during this early period, the expression Holocaust was not yet in use. So survivors used various other words to describe the recent destruction. For example, the Hebrew word churban, which is also used on this poster. So Holocaust survivors dominated the field of Holocaust memorialization in the post-war years. The early works of documentation, the statistics of death and survival, the memorial services, they were all undertaken within the Jewish communities of survivors around Europe, including in the DP camps. However, post-war European life as it existed in the post-war period was elusive and only temporary. Within a few years, many of the communities ceased to exist. Jewish survivors emigrated, mostly to Israel, but to other places as well, or died, and the DP camps were dissolved. The new rivalries and new narratives of the Cold War and the new national mythologies erased many of these memorial structures and what they were standing for. Also because they kind of did not fit these new narratives of the war propagated by nation states or ideologies such as communism. Today, we would like to introduce two fascinating stories about disappearing monuments that we would have loved to, as I said, include in the exhibit. One is the memorial column in Zeilsheim, which is near Frankfurt, and the other one is the Raoul Wallenberg statue in Budapest. and my dear friend and former colleague Moritz will present the Zeilsheim case.
Yes, thank you, Kata, and thank you for everybody involved here for giving me this opportunity to revisit our mutual project here together, and for the opportunity as well to shed some light on forgotten, or at least I think inadequately remembered memorial site in Frankfurt. Before I start talking about the memorial itself, which you can already see here in these pictures, and which was pictured quite often as it was a popular photo location for group portraits at the time. Before I start with the memorial, I will preface everything by giving a bit of context about the case of Frankfurt in post-war years, and by stressing that indeed the post-war story of Frankfurt was twofold, as we showed in our exhibition, Our Courage, as well. So there was, on the one hand, the story of the surviving remnants of the city's community, being less than 200 people of the former almost 30,000 community members in Frankfurt. And on the other hand, the DPs, the displaced persons in Zeilsheim. The Zeilsheim DP camp was typical in a sense that it was established, as many other camps, as being mainly for Central Eastern European survivors. And it was on the grounds of the former prisoners' barracks, opened again in August of 1945. The first people to arrive there were Buchenwald survivors, and the barracks you can see still in these pictures here, in the left and on the right as well. Not that much later, in fall of 1945, the first people were transferred to nearby houses. Altogether 200 houses in a former, or in a still in use, working class quarter, which was erected initially for workers of the infamous IG Farben in Frankfurt Höchst. Also, this camp was quite atypical, being a model camp in a sense, as it was the first one where exclusively Jewish DPs were living. And these inhabitants, they weren't sorted by their country of origin like it was done before. Later, when they were transferred to their houses, it meant also that the camp was not really enclosed against its surroundings, and a small number of non-Jewish inhabitants still stayed on the campground. So there was still a functioning bakery operating there. So as a first conclusion, I would say that Zeilsheim was in a situation of an unclear separation, and also still pretty much in transaction to the outside world. And this being also an exemption to many other camps we are looking into in our research. Non-Jewish members of the local historical society nowadays in Zeilsheim remember also there being sort of an imaginary border, as they described it to me. And they also remember, or their parents as well, perhaps, visiting, for example, DP sporting events. So there was always sort of an interaction going on there. For relief organizations like the UNRWA, or later, after 47, the IRO, the camp was seen as a role model, or more like an archetype, I would say. And they brought prominent figures in for visits when they were touring the US occupied zone in Germany. We have documents, or it was documented that Ben-Gurion, for example, visited twice, and also Eleanor Roosevelt went there while touring the American occupied zones in Germany. Another thing I want to stress is that reasoning for all these DPs coming to Frankfurt was in the first place that the American military headquarters was situated there. So it meant for them mainly not going to Germany, but it made for them a promise for the transit later on to the USA possibly. So all the tropes we know about from the different DP camps, different situations, like the topoi of living on packed suitcases, the DP camp as a waiting room, everything applies also to Zeilsheim, I would say. Talking numbers, we have a problem here. We can say that around 3,000 people were living there, give or take, probably a couple of hundred more at a given time always. But the total number of people in transit going through Zeilsheim is pretty much uncertain. We don't have documentation on this, so I cannot help you out with this. However, I can tell that most of the people left until the end of 1948. The remaining ones moved either out of Germany into other camps inside of Germany, or as it was the case for around 200 people, they moved directly into Frankfurt at the latest when the camp was dissolved on the 16th of November, 1948. So before I go to the monument itself, I'll take a short detour and I ask Kata to switch to the next slide here. I'll take a short detour to the city itself. As I said in the beginning, it was a twofold story we were presenting. And there's another comparable monument or a plaque for the synagogue at the Börnerplatz in the city center. As I said, the city was a quite different story from Zeilsheim, with its core being around 300 survivors coming back from Terezin or Theresienstadt. And when they returned on the 20th of March, 1946, this plaque you see here was inaugurated. But important, it was a part of the official remembrance, which was arranged by the American military administration. It is still situated today roughly at the same place at its original memorial site, on the backside of a new building, which was erected in the 1980s and 90s, which is also housing today the Museum Judengasse. And as you can see, the English text is in the translation on the bottom of it. I can read it for you, but you can see it yourself. It's here stood the Börnerplatz synagogue, which was destroyed by Nazi criminals on the 9th of November, 1938. So coming back now to Zeilsheim, and I asked Kata to see it again, thank you. About the monument here, you can see two more pictures now. We don't know much for sure, I can tell you, but there are some things we can deduce and speculate about regarding this monument there. So let's start by describing it from the outset. How does it look? We see a four-sided stele, or let's say column, as Kata said, made of brickwork with a shield of David on top of it. There are three inscriptions on it that we know of. One is in Ivrit, one is in English, and the other one, I think we didn't find a picture yet which shows it clearly. And the English text basically is saying it's in memory of our dear people who were murdered under the Nazi regime. The left picture gives you sort of an answer of who instated it and when it was opened. So it shows you the ceremony of the inauguration on 11th of April in 1946. And the person standing in front is Rabbi Leon Forn. The date was chosen because it was the first anniversary, in fact, of the liberation of Buchenwald. And as I said before, the first people that came to this camp were actually survivors of the Buchenwald camp. Most importantly and most disputed is when and why did it disappear? First of all, we don't have any sources from the DPs themselves that give us a lead to answer this question. The survivors that still live today in Frankfurt, they have no recollection about the whereabouts of this monument. And when I was talking, as I said before, to the non-Jewish inhabitants of Zeilsheim today, I learned that their tale is basically that the star and the plaques were allegedly removed just at the same time of the dissolution of the camp in November of 48. We can, of course, speculate that probably the bricks from the main statue were directly reused as building material. I finish with some thoughts about what we can find on its place today and what this can tell us about the remembrance in today's Frankfurt. As you can see here, there's another memorial now that the city dedicated in 1988. There are though some critical differences in these two monuments. Remarkably, this plaque here says that it commemorates the camp itself, so it also includes the German prisoners of war that were another part of this barracks station for a time. And it also is not dedicated to the victims of the Nazi rule in a broader sense as it was in the original memorial. And also it gives a number of around 5,000 DPs that were there allegedly at the time. If you pinch a bit, you see that in the upper part, there are some structures represented here in this picture. And to me, it also suggests that this camp was basically made of barracks the whole time, which is not true, as we have learned that many of the Jewish DPs were actually moved to housing in these working class settlements there. Also, the site of this monument here is shifted from its original position where the former was built, as there is now a nursery in its place, I learned. And these pictures you're seeing here is just what I took and how it presented to me last weekend. I can tell you a thing that you don't see in these pictures, that is that the backside of it, of this column, is covered in graffiti today and in some other scribblings, which I could not make out that they had any relation to the contents depicted here. But I think it shows quite strongly a care for and relevance for the site today. So to conclude, I think unlike the examples that we were presented by Professor Stola before, and also by what Kata already told about Bialystok, for example, this here is not a memorial that was placed on the crime scene, I would say, but is a remnant, or was a remnant, of the temporary place of transit. So the DP camp as the waiting room, as we come to know it. I would say that this original memorial, which we lost, unfortunately, was singularly a project of the DPs at the time. And it also disappeared with them from memory and from Frankfurt today, and is then being superseded, as it is now, by another monument with a different statement. And I would say also with little relevance for the city's society and the official city society remembering it today. So this is where I stop with this part and hand it over to Kata, who will lead us on to Budapest.
With a quick jump over the Iron Curtain, I'm going to talk about another memorial that disappeared, which is the Wallenberg Memorial in Budapest. And the Swedish diplomat is perhaps one of the most well-known figures among those who saved Jews during the war. Wallenberg, who was the son of a well-to-do Swedish aristocratic family, arrived to lead the Swedish legation in Budapest in the summer of 1944, when the deportations of Hungarian Jews in the provinces were well underway. Having no doubts that the same fate awaited the about 200,000 strong Jewish community of Budapest, that was to be the last one to be deported, Wallenberg issued thousands of Swedish protective passports, so the so-called Schutzpasses, to Hungarian Jews, and also sheltered many in protected buildings in the Hungarian capital. What is also very well known about him is his mysterious disappearance, because the last sighting of him was on January 17th, 1945, when he was seen in the company of Soviet officials of the Red Army that besieged Budapest at the time. Presumably, he was detained on suspicion of espionage and was subsequently murdered by the NKVD, the Soviet law enforcement and secret police organization. But the exact date and circumstances of his death are uncertain up to this day. So the end of the war saw about 220 to 140,000 survivors in the Hungarian capital, forming one of the largest remaining Jewish communities in post-war Europe, whose early post-war history is presented in greater detail in the Our Courage exhibit as well. Those survivors in the Budapest Jewish community who owed their lives to the Swedish diplomat initiated as early as November 1945 that a memorial sculpture be erected to commemorate Wallenberg. They even suggested a location for the sculpture in a park called Szent István Park, which was near those buildings that were protected by the Swedish legation through Wallenberg's activities. They also found a sculptor who would create a sculpture that was worthy of the Swedish diplomat's heroic efforts. The plan was approved by the office of Zoltán Vas, the communist mayor of Budapest. The Jewish community even formed a committee to organize a donation drive, which suffered several setbacks, but eventually they themselves managed to collect the money that was needed for the memorial sculpture. Pál Pátzay, a well-known and decorated sculptor, designed a monumental, you can see it in the image, 6-meter tall sculpture depicting a muscular man squeezing the neck of a snake that is attacking him. In the base of the sculpture, Pátzay inserted Wallenberg's profile and a plaque with a text that I will talk about a little bit later. The sculpture was supposed to be unveiled in Szent István Park on April 10th, 1949. In fact, it had been already standing in the small green public space next to the river Danube for a few days, and this is when this photo was taken. And it was ready and waiting for the big reveal. However, the inauguration of the statue never took place. During the night of April 9th, there was an unusual commotion around the sculpture. The sculptor, Pál Pátzay, got a phone call from his friend, the writer Lajos Hatvany, in the wee hours of the morning. Hatvany, who lived right next to the park where the sculpture stood, witnessed what was happening. "Pali, your sculpture is being demolished right now," he shouted into the telephone. But by the time the confused and rather panicked Pátzay made his way to the scene from the other side of the river, he only found the empty space where his sculpture used to stand. The sculpture was taken down by the communist authorities and disappeared from sight. As it soon turned out, the authorities took the sculpture down on direct Soviet orders. Soviet authorities in 1949 probably wanted to avoid the publicity about Wallenberg's suspicious disappearance, and thus instructed Hungarian authorities to call off the inauguration of the monument. However, even though the inauguration was aborted, the artwork itself managed to survive. A year later, in August 1950, Pátzay exhibited a smaller version of it in Budapest Hall of Art during the first Hungarian Fine Art exhibition. It was quite a big event with a lot of visitors. The bronze sculpture had received a new title. It was called Figure with a Snake this time, and was now presented as an anti-fascist work, symbolizing the fight between ideologies where the good man, symbolizing socialism or anti-fascism, triumphs over the evil snake, fascism. As it happened, an architect entrusted with the planning of a pharmaceutical company's penicillin production building in the city of Debrecen in the east of Hungary saw Pátzay's sculpture in the exhibit, and he decided to get it for the garden of the future building. And thus, in 1952 or 1953, a copy of the original Wallenberg sculpture, which was now referred to as the Snake Killer, was permanently erected in front of the Biogal pharmaceutical company. Meanwhile, the repaired original statue was placed in the forested area behind the company buildings, hidden out of sight. The male figure with the snake appeared on millions of medication packages in Hungary during communism, and thus it acquired a new allegorical meaning as the fight against diseases. And it was not until the collapse of communism that the issue of the Wallenberg monument was taken up again. As a result of a common effort of private citizens and Budapest's first democratically elected mayor, Gábor Demszky, plans were made to re-erect the copy of the original Wallenberg statue in Szent István Park, so in its original place. I would like to emphasize here that at this point, it was not the Jewish community that officially initiated the new monument. However, as a result of the effort, a copy of the structure then standing in Debrecen were made by another sculptor, because the old master Pátzay died in 1979. And one of Pátzay's students recreated the copy of the Wallenberg profile, which had been part of the base. The old new statue was erected again in its original place on April 18th, 1999, almost exactly 50 years after the original one was supposed to be inaugurated. It is also worth noting that the text inscribed in the base of the structure, which is still standing in Szent István Park today, I took this photo about 3 weeks ago, it does not refer to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust explicitly. Let this memorial announce our endless gratitude in the center of the city, where his unending humanity protected the victims in the darkness of an inhuman age. So goes the inscription after it briefly presents Wallenberg. This inscription is also the exact copy of the original one and testifies to the restraints on the early memory of World War II in Eastern Europe in the shadow of communism. Communist doctrine interpreted World War II as the struggle between fascism and anti-fascism, and in this monumental battle, the persecution of Jews was but an episode, leaving no room for the narrative about their racial persecution. Thus, this euphemistic description in the text, which remarkably was not changed in the 1990s, and stands like that on the sculpture's base up to this day, commemorates not only Raoul Wallenberg, but to some extent, communism's controversial relationship with Holocaust memory as well. Now, to conclude, we would like to emphasize again the tremendous memory work within the survivor communities that resulted in the first Holocaust memorial structures in the early post-war years. The monuments erected by the Jewish communities in Europe helped develop the narrative of the recent destruction from a distinctly Jewish perspective. As such, they testify to this incredible will of survivors to regain their agency, determine their own history, to tell their own stories, and rebuild Jewish life to come. It is also noteworthy that some of the symbolism of the Holocaust, both in terms of imagery and language, can already be found on these early structures. However, they also bear witness of their time. The Hungarian monument does not mention Jews explicitly because this was not possible in the early years of communism. And the Telsheim Memorial, in its very simple column-like appearance, represents a very general and very widespread first memorialization tradition, in which usually the Jewish communities also inscribe actually the names of the victims on thousands of columns like that across Europe. Even though the two original monuments were presented here today disappeared, both of them were replaced by newer ones, but with a changed meaning. The Holocaust is not a strictly Jewish issue anymore as it was in the first post-war years, but gained a universal moral significance. In both cases, while the original memorial structures were erected by the survivor Jewish community, the newer ones are standing as a result of state or municipal initiatives. And in both cases, the memorial structure now stands not exclusively for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The newer memorials were erected during transformative times, when new narratives of the past were needed and in the making. Towards the end of the Cold War, around the collapse of communism and following a drastic change in West Germany's interpretation of the Nazi past, following the famous historical strike in the case of the Telsheim monument, the newer one. And this, more than anything, proves that the Holocaust has become a cornerstone of post-Cold War European identities, but also that its history is just as relevant as in the immediate post-war years. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my screen. Here we go.
Well, thank you, Kata and Moritz, for these fascinating two examples of disappearing monuments I think even though there is this similarity of vanishing, there is also striking differences. And I would like to, I have a few questions on these differences, actually. It seems to me as if the monument of Zeilsheim has to do with the specific site, with the site of the first exclusively Jewish displaced person camp, which needed a kind of a symbolic site, because due to the fact that Frankfurt was the US headquarters and there was this, distinguished, it was a distinguished travel site too for international organizations and representatives, it needed a site, where there a specific site for commemoration ceremonies, but for all other kind of, symbolic moments. And so for me, the monument really relates to the camp itself and to where the camp was situated. So it's and it's more a memorial that is not symbolizing what happened, but rather, kind of marking a site and a place. I'm wondering if you agree to this, Moritz. Well, maybe let's leave it like this first. What do you think?
No, I totally agree in the sense that there is a reason why this monument is always in the pictures. Like we said, it's a focal point for all these dignitaries coming there. The pictures we have of Eleanor Roosevelt in Zeilsheim, there's always the monument in the background. So it's totally constitutional, I think, for this special camp that it is in fact a Jewish camp and not a DP camp where Poles, Romanians, Yugoslavians, or whoever is situated. In another sense, I disagree that the inscription is dedicated to the Shoah. So more so, I think actually the replacement monument is a statue to the camp itself. I think the camp really became the symbol for Zeilsheim. Also, if we remember the title of our exhibition, Unser Mut, Our Courage, was taken from the camp's newspaper. And on the first front pages of this paper, there's always the monument as an imprint there. So it's really a powerful symbol for this camp, especially for the situation of DPs at this time. And yeah, as I said, it's quite telling that the focal point shifted from this being the symbol for the DP camp, for the Jewish DP camp, and also commemorating the Shoah, to now being just for the campsite in itself and painting it as a picture of a couple of barracks where also, lest we forget, the Germans were staying, the non-Jewish Germans.
And Kata, to you, I mean, Raoul Wallenberg is a heroic figure, and there is Wallenberg monuments all over Europe. There is one in Stockholm, there is in other places. So I was wondering, I mean, it's a fascinating story, this wandering monument, which has, different meanings. But I was wondering whether this fact that Raoul Wallenberg is a known figure, and that there is monuments in other European cities for him, had that an impact on the re-erection of the monument at its original site?
Yes, so the monument, or the non-existing monument at that time, was really used, especially by the American and the Swedish diplomats, as kind of a pressure to put pressure on the Hungarian communist leadership at that time. Not because there were other monuments in Europe, but more because of the growing significance of Wallenberg, because he was so well known. For example, in the early 1980s, so a little bit earlier than the monument was eventually re-erected, the American embassy, which if anybody has been in Budapest, it's right in the middle of the city. It's in a very central place. The American embassy actually erected their own monument on embassy grounds to Raoul Wallenberg, and even though the embassy was fenced in, of course, everybody who walked there could see it. And then eventually in the late 1980s, another Wallenberg monument was kind of gifted to the Hungarian government by the Swedish embassy, basically making it impossible for them to refuse this offer. And if we are to believe to one of the members of the Swedish diplomatic corps at that time, when János Kádár, the leader of the Communist Party and the general secretary, went to Sweden at that time and was told about this, he kind of resigned and not resigned, but he gave in and said, well, there's another thing that I will have to explain to the Russians or to the Soviets. So it definitely had a significance, and this is also shown by the fact that in Hungarian public discourse, it kind of, even during the period when it was absolutely not possible to talk about Wallenberg, it kind of resurfaces again and again. For example, we know that this architect who decided to put the Wallenberg statue in front of the pharmaceutical company, he was actually reproached, like he was asked, why on earth, this is the Wallenberg statue, do you know what you're doing putting this there? So everybody, it's really interesting that everybody knew what it really stood for. But then it acquired these extra allegorical meanings.
That's what I was wondering. I was wondering actually if this is a kind of, I mean, there is hidden stories, that there is stories that are being told, and there is oral stories that are related with places and persons that are not being told, but that find its way to be told. And I was wondering if the reinvention that the snake was actually sickness and was such a form of not really telling the story of Wallenberg bluntly, but indirectly.
Yes, I think it definitely stayed, like this other meaning definitely stayed with more, I mean, primarily, of course, with the survivors, but not only the survivors. Everybody knew about it. This was quite a big scandal, or quite a big shock at the time when this monument was not inaugurated and that disappeared. As I said, that actually the Hungarian authorities okayed it before, so it was very well known by everybody what it stood for. So definitely, just replacing it or putting it somewhere else definitely was not enough to erase all this knowledge and all this awareness.
May I ask if Dariusz, are you still in the Zoom call so that you can join in our discussion? That would be really nice.
Here I am.
You are?
Here I am.
Okay, wonderful. I was wondering, because both Moritz and Kata were strengthening the fact that the first monuments were actually initiated by the Jewish community. Would you say the same for Poland?
Well, certainly. And it's very clear what languages are used. These early monuments, as a rule, have inscription in Yiddish, the language those people spoke. And they are erected, they are funded with committees. The Jewish communities raised money for them. There is public support for it at that time. But at that moment, you have Jewish communists who actually, they also feel, they feel a part of this community. They may hate the Zionists or Bundists, but this is the effort that there is a kind of unity. The problem may be what is the inscription. I'm very interested in this conclusion of a tendency of moving from an inner Jewish history to something broader. I mean, national or universal meaning of it. Certainly, the top-down tendency of the communist propaganda was to make it a part of the anti-fascist struggle. So on the one hand, you have crimes of the fascists. On the other hand, you have the anti-fascist struggle, and Jews are lost in this internationalist language of anti-fascism. But this is only late 40s, actually early 50s when it happens. The Rappaport monument was unveiled in spring 2048, so it was still possible to show clearly that was a Jewish tragedy.
Yeah, it's really interesting that even though, on the language, the Yiddish language and so on, it's the who initiated the monument is clear, but in most cases, it's a commemoration of what happened, not exclusively to Jews, right? I mean, that's not how it's framed. But there is this kind of, form of commemoration of loss in a more universal sense. Would you agree to that from a particular perspective or a particular experience?
Well, it is a universalizing tendency. And I would say that makes it an interesting point of analysis, because we have conflicting tendencies of universalize or disuniversalize. Let me mention there is a famous statement which actually became kind of the motto of many of the commemorations in Polish, that human beings did these horrible things to other human beings. While today, we have some authors who claim, oh, you're hiding that was a part of the crime against the Jews. These were not human beings persecuting other human beings. These were Nazi Germans persecuting the Jews. So and the Polish debates, which I was mentioning about, there is an interesting tendency to move from the universal aspects of the questions raised to national aspects. For example, the poem by Czesław Miłosz, which Miłosz wrote in Warsaw in 1943, he was an eyewitness of the end of the Warsaw Ghetto. He could see the ghetto in flames. He was on the other side of the ghetto wall. He wrote, the title of the poem is Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto. And it's basically about the non-Jews watching this horrible scene. But the debate in the late 1980s, which started with the reading of his poem, the title of the article about it was Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. So from a kind of universal problem of the non-Jews, the Christians, it was reduced to the particular national problem of the Poles. And I think it probably gave the high emotional intensity to the debate, because nationalism is still one of the powerful political ideas of today. But we lost this way something, I would say, deeper in this debate. The Polish debates have a tendency to have, I would say, this provincial national perspective too often than they have. It's good for the debate, for the dynamics of the debate, but I am afraid we are losing something universal about it.
It's really interesting that we are coming to this point of actually the phrases and the forms in which those first Holocaust or early Holocaust monuments were commemorating what happened. On the background of how we started off today, yesterday, we had a performance lecture of Philip Sands' East West Street book, and this morning we talked. Had a talk with Philip Sands, and he put an emphasis on the difference between crimes against humanity as putting an emphasis on the individual and on the crime against the individual and the humanity in the individual, and genocide as the term for the crime against the group. And said that today we have the tendency to look more at the group, and that genocide is actually the term, where you get on the front page of a newspaper, whereas crimes against humanity back then, when Lauterbach invented the term and when there was the Nuremberg main proceedings, it was much more common term. So the perception on what the Shoah meant for the individual was that was his, or that's how I understood him, was a much more common perception back then, and for me there is a relation to what we were talking about now about the inscription of the monuments. Would you agree to that?
Well, I think it was certainly the dominant perception of the lawyers of the time. It's a sophisticated legal term, and the contribution of Lemkin is not only in changing the language, the front pages of the newspapers, where he's present in this world, but making an important contribution and a dilemma for the law, at least the law of the West, which then expanded globally. I must say that Lauterbach saw something, and that was his criticism of the Lemkin idea, that defending a group which is the target of persecution is a shaky ground, because actually, in a way, we are following the perpetrators. For example, the problem with the victims of the Holocaust is among the more than 3 million Polish Jews, there were people who did not consider themselves Jews. People whose parents converted to Christianity, or people who were far away from, well, they had other identities which were more important for them than the identity of their parents. So I think it's a delicate matter. We should talk about it, remembering the complexity of the things. But certainly, in this dispute between Lauterbach and Lemkin won. His idea proved much more in line with the contemporary way of thinking what is the most horrible thing that can happen. And there is indeed even certain competition. Many victim groups try to get the label of being persecuted with a genocide.
Kata, would you like to add on that?
I actually wanted to go back to a point that Professor Stola mentioned earlier, and that was this loneliness of the Jewish victims during the war. Because what we haven't talked about, but Professor Stola mentioned, but we could also echo that, is that you look at this monument as it stands in Budapest today, not mentioning the fact that the victims are Jews that we are talking about. And the problem is not exactly that, but the other, because everybody knows that we are talking about Jews at this point. But the other problem is that this assigned, the assigned perpetrator is not being discussed, or at least it's being discussed in a very eschewed way. In Hungary today, similar to the situation in Poland, the dominant political discourse assigns the guilt solely towards Nazi Germany, and doesn't point to the loneliness of the victims in the way that Hungarian Jews were could be victims of Nazi Germany because the Hungarian public administration and Hungarian population at large did not, or cooperated with the Germans in case of the administration, agreed with anti-Semitic legislation instituted by Hungarian governments, legally elected, and a lot of the majority of the population did not do anything at best, to be honest. At worst, they stole everything that was even movable after their Jewish compatriots were deported. So I think this is another issue that would worth another panel to talk about, is what does it mean for the victims to be lonely.
And can we compensate for the loneliness 50 years later or 70 years later?
Well, thank you very much to all three of you for your very interesting lecture and for our discussion. I think the loneliness of the victim will play a role this evening. We have a reading from the book by Minka Pradelski and a talk with her. Es wird wieder Tag. This will be in German, and I'm really grateful for our discussion. Thank you that you joined us virtually, it's a real pity that you couldn't see the exhibition Dariusz and Kata and Moritz, that you couldn't see it again, but it will be on display in Berlin from the beginning of April. So maybe there you have a chance. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again this evening. We start at 8 o'clock with our reading and talk about the book with Minka Pradelski. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.